JD Vance walked through the grand doors of the courtroom, his heart swelling with hope. The polished wooden floors gleamed under the bright overhead lights. The towering shelves of law books lined the walls, filled with the wisdom of generations past. He took a deep breath, the scent of aged paper and varnished wood filling his lungs. This was the place where justice was meant to prevail, a place where the powerless could stand as equals before the law. As he stepped forward, memories of his childhood flooded his mind. He remembered sitting on his grandmother's porch, the warm summer air wrapping around them as she spoke with unwavering conviction. "The law is for the people, JD. It's meant to serve the honest and protect the weak." Those words had stayed with him, a guiding light through the darkness of struggle, through the long nights spent studying, through the challenges that had shaped him into the man he was today. He looked around the room, taking in the faces that filled the space. Lawyers shuffling papers, clerks hurrying to their stations, citizens waiting anxiously for their turn before the judge. There was an air of authority in the courtroom, a carefully maintained image of fairness. But beneath it, JD could sense something else, something rotten. The unspoken truth that justice was not always blind, that power could tilt the scales, that corruption could seep into the very foundations of the law. At the center of it all sat the judge. Draped in black robes, his presence should have been imposing, his authority a beacon of fairness. But JD saw something different. A man who had long abandoned the duty that came with his position. A man whose eyes held no warmth, only calculation. A man who saw justice not as a sacred duty, but as a tool to serve his own interests. JD tightened his jaw, his hands forming into fists at his sides. He had come here for truth, for accountability. But he was about to discover just how deeply the roots of corruption had wrapped themselves around this courtroom. The battle for justice was no longer just an ideal. It was about to become a fight. JD Vance took his seat near the front, his eyes fixed on the judge who now presided over the courtroom. The man sat tall in his chair, his robe draped over his shoulders like a king surveying his kingdom. His expression was stern, but not with the weight of responsibility. No, it was the look of a man who enjoyed control. A man who thrived on the knowledge that his word was final, his power unchecked. JD had read about him before. Judge Harrington, a name whispered in legal circles, not with respect, but with quiet contempt. He was known for favoring the wealthy, for dismissing cases that threatened those in power, for turning a blind eye when justice demanded action. JD clenched his fist beneath the table. This was exactly the kind of man who made ordinary people lose faith in the system. The courtroom was packed. Lawyers whispered to their clients, journalists scribbled notes, and a few worried citizens sat on the wooden benches, watching with anxious eyes. A case like this should have been routine, a simple ruling, an easy decision based on facts. But JD knew better. With a judge like Harrington, the law was not about facts, it was about influence, about who could pull the right strings behind the scenes. Harrington cleared his throat, his voice thick with impatience. "Let's move this along. I don't have all day." His words were sharp, dismissive. JD narrowed his eyes. A judge was supposed to be patient, fair, deliberate. But this man acted as if justice was an inconvenience. A defense attorney stood to present his case, but Harrington barely listened. He tapped his fingers against the desk, sighing, shaking his head before the lawyer could even finish a sentence. Then, with an exaggerated roll of his eyes, he leaned forward. "I've already made up my mind," he said, his tone dripping with arrogance. "We don't need to waste any more time with this nonsense." JD felt his stomach tighten. A decision had been made before the evidence was even fully presented, before witnesses could be heard, before the truth had a chance to be spoken. This wasn't justice. This was a performance, and JD Vance was about to make sure the entire world saw it for what it was. JD Vance leaned forward slightly, his eyes locked on Judge Harrington. He had seen arrogance before, but this was something else entirely. The judge wasn't just dismissive, he was mocking the very foundation of justice. The air in the room grew tense as murmurs spread through the courtroom. People exchanged nervous glances, but no one dared to challenge the man who held the gavel. Then, without warning, Judge Harrington smirked and turned his gaze directly toward JD. His voice dripped with condescension. Well, well, he said, leaning back in his chair. Look who decided to join us today. JD Vance, the self-righteous senator, gracing my courtroom with his presence. A few chuckles echoed from the defense table. Wealthy attorneys who thrived under judges like Harrington. JD didn't flinch. He expected resistance, but he hadn't expected the judge to attack him outright. You've been running around Washington pretending to care about the working class, Harrington continued, his voice growing louder. But let's be honest, Vance. You're just another politician in a suit. You think you understand the law? You think you belong here? The words hit hard, but JD refused to look away. He knew this tactic. When corruption was called out, those in power turned to insults. They belittled. They mocked. They tried to make the opposition feel small. It was nothing more than a shield, a distraction from the real issue at hand. JD took a breath and slowly stood. The room went silent. All eyes were on him. Even the court reporter had stopped typing. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him, but he wouldn't let it shake him. With all due respect, Your Honor, JD said calmly, his voice steady, this case isn't about me. It's about justice, or at least what's left of it in this courtroom. A few gasps rippled through the audience. The judge's smirk faltered for just a second before twisting into a sneer. He tapped his gavel on the bench, the sharp sound cutting through the silence. This is my courtroom, Harrington snapped, and I decide what justice looks like here, not you. JD didn't back down. He took a step forward, his voice stronger now. That's where you're wrong. Justice doesn't belong to you. It belongs to the people. The judge's face reddened with anger. His authority had never been challenged like this before, not in his own courtroom. But JD Vance wasn't finished. You sit up there wearing that robe, pretending to represent the law, JD continued, his tone unwavering. But real justice isn't about power or ego. It's about the truth. And today the truth is going to be heard, whether you like it or not. The room was electrified. Even those who had once laughed at the judge's insults were now watching with rapt attention. For the first time, the man behind the bench looked unsettled. But JD knew this was only the beginning. The real battle was just getting started. Judge Harrington's grip on the gavel tightened. His knuckles turned white as he glared at JD Vance, his nostrils flaring with barely contained rage. For years, he had ruled his courtroom like a monarch, his authority unquestioned, his judgments final. No one had ever dared to speak to him this way, and certainly not in front of a full courtroom. You're out of line, Vance, the judge spat, his voice sharp. This is a legal proceeding, not a campaign rally. If you don't sit down and keep your mouth shut, I'll have you removed. JD didn't flinch. He had seen men like Harrington before, powerful figures who mistook fear for respect. But JD wasn't afraid, and he wasn't about to let this judge silence the truth. Removed? JD repeated, his voice calm but firm. For what? For calling out corruption? For refusing to let you twist the law to fit your own interests? He took a step closer. You can throw me out, Judge, but you can't silence the truth. Not today. A heavy silence fell over the room. The spectators, citizens, journalists, even the attorneys were riveted. They had all seen this judge operate before. They had witnessed his arrogance, his unchecked power, but never had anyone stood up to him like this. Harrington's face darkened. He lifted his gavel and slammed it against the bench. Enough, he roared. You think you can walk in here and lecture me about the law? You're nothing but a politician pretending to be a hero. You want justice? You don't even know what that word means. JD's eyes narrowed. I know exactly what it means, he said. Justice means standing up for those who don't have a voice. It means holding people like you accountable when you abuse the power you were given. The judge let out a bitter laugh. Abuse? That's a strong accusation, Senator. He leaned forward, his lips curling into a smirk. Tell me, where's your proof? Because last I checked, the only opinion that matters in this courtroom is mine. JD inhaled deeply. He had expected this. He knew the judge would try to dismiss him, to turn this into a battle of words. But JD wasn't here to argue. He was here to expose the truth. Without breaking eye contact, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a thick folder. The reporters in the room sat up straighter, sensing the shift in energy. JD flipped the folder open, revealing a stack of documents. "These are financial records," JD said, his voice carrying through the room. "They show a pattern of decisions you've made in favor of corporations and wealthy elites. Decisions that magically align with deposits made into offshore accounts linked to your name." The judge's smirk vanished. A ripple of shock spread through the courtroom. The defense attorneys exchanged nervous glances. The journalists scribbled furiously. JD took another step forward, holding up a second set of papers. "These are sworn testimonies from former clerks and attorneys who worked under you. They detail cases where you deliberately ruled against everyday citizens while protecting those with money and power." A murmur swept through the courtroom. Judge Harrington's face was pale now, but his jaw was clenched tight. His eyes darted toward the bailiff, as if considering ordering JD's removal. But it was too late. The room had already turned against him. JD set the papers down on the prosecution's table. "This isn't just corruption," he said. "It's a betrayal of the oath you took when you put on that robe." He met the judge's eyes, unwavering. "You don't serve justice. You serve yourself." The weight of JD's words hung in the air. For the first time in his career, Judge Harrington looked uncertain. His power, his shield of arrogance, was cracking, and JD wasn't done yet. The judge's lips pressed into a thin line, his face growing redder by the second. His hands clenched the armrests of his chair, as if gripping onto the last shreds of control. The once mighty Harrington, who had ruled over his courtroom with unchecked authority, was now exposed in front of everyone. "You think you can just waltz in here with your so-called evidence and challenge me?" Harrington's voice was strained, but the desperation behind it was undeniable. "This is nothing but political theater. You don't belong in this courtroom, Vance. You're not a lawyer. You're not a judge. You have no authority here." JD Vance tilted his head slightly, studying the man in front of him. "No, I'm not a judge," he admitted, "but neither are you. Not anymore." He gestured toward the pile of documents now sitting on the prosecution's table. "The evidence speaks for itself. You've taken bribes. You've ignored the law. You've turned this courtroom into a personal business where justice is bought and sold." The room was so silent that the sound of a pen dropping would have echoed. The reporters had stopped writing, their eyes locked onto the unfolding drama. Some of the attorneys exchanged uneasy glances, realizing that they had built careers under this man's rule. Judge Harrington slammed his gavel down with force. "That's enough." His voice wavered now, the confidence draining from it. "You have no right to stand there and accuse me of corruption. You have no proof." JD held up a document. "This is a signed affidavit from a former law clerk who worked under you. He details exactly how you instructed him to alter legal opinions to favor corporate defendants." He tossed it onto the table. "This one is a bank statement linking offshore accounts to payments that coincided with your rulings." Another paper hit the table. "And these are case files where you ruled in favor of your political allies, dismissing legitimate lawsuits to protect their interests." The judge's mouth opened, but no words came out. He looked around the room, his eyes darting from face to face. He was losing control, and he knew it. JD took a step closer. "You can pound that gavel all you want, but the truth is already out. You're not untouchable. You never were." The bailiff shifted uncomfortably, glancing toward the judge for direction. The defense attorneys looked pale, knowing their golden ticket in the legal system was unraveling. Then, as if grasping for one final shred of authority, Judge Harrington stood from his chair and pointed a trembling finger at JD. "You're a fraud, Vance. You act like you care about justice, but you're just another politician looking for attention." JD didn't blink. He let the words settle in the air for a moment before responding. "I didn't come here for attention. I came here because people like you think you can get away with anything, because you sit in that chair and pretend to serve the law when all you serve is yourself." His voice was steady, unwavering. "But today you don't get to hide behind that bench. Today everyone in this room sees you for what you are." A heavy silence followed. The judge's chest rose and fell quickly, his breaths coming in shallow gasps. His reign over the courtroom was slipping through his fingers, and he could feel it. Then, in a final act of desperation, he did something no one expected. He stormed down from his bench. Judge Harrington's footsteps echoed through the tense courtroom as he stormed down from his bench. His face was flushed with anger, his breath ragged, but his eyes burned with something deeper: fear. For years he had commanded this room with absolute power, his word final, his rulings unquestioned. But now his authority was crumbling before him, exposed under the weight of undeniable truth. He stepped up to JD Vance, standing mere inches away, his finger jabbing the air. "You think you've won something here?" he hissed, his voice low but shaking with rage. "You think bringing in some paperwork is enough to take me down?" His lips curled into a sneer, but it no longer held the confidence it once did. "I've seen people like you come and go. You make a big speech, wave around some documents, and think that makes you powerful. But the real power? That's in knowing the right people. And trust me, Vance, you don't know the people I do." JD didn't move. He met the judge's glare with an unshaken stare, his posture unyielding. "That's where you're wrong," JD said, his voice calm but cutting through the tension like a blade. "Real power isn't in knowing the right people. It's in doing the right thing." Harrington let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. "Spare me the speech. You're standing here like some hero, but you have no idea what you've started. You think you can just walk into my courtroom and change the system?" He leaned in closer, lowering his voice. "You have no idea how deep this goes, Vance. No idea who you're up against." JD's eyes narrowed. He had expected pushback, but the way Harrington spoke, the veiled threats, the desperation in his voice, confirmed something he had already suspected. This wasn't just about one corrupt judge. It was bigger, deeper, an entire network of people who had spent years manipulating the law to serve themselves. JD glanced around the room. People were watching in stunned silence. The court stenographer had stopped typing, her fingers frozen over the keys. The journalists, their pens hovering over notepads, were waiting, knowing this moment would be written into headlines across the country. JD took a step forward, his voice unwavering. "If you're admitting this goes deeper than just you, then that's all the more reason why it needs to be exposed." He gestured toward the prosecution table, where the damning evidence lay in plain sight. "This isn't just about one corrupt judge. This is about the people who think they own the system, who think they can bend the law to serve their own interests while hard-working Americans suffer." Judge Harrington scoffed, but there was no true confidence left in him. "You don't know what you're doing," he muttered. JD tilted his head. "No, I know exactly what I'm doing. I'm putting an end to it." Harrington's jaw clenched, his nostrils flaring. He turned toward the bailiff, his voice sharp. "Remove this man from my courtroom. Now!" The bailiff hesitated. His hand hovered near his holster, unsure if he should obey. He wasn't just a security officer. He had worked under this judge for years. But now in this moment, something shifted. He had seen corruption before, but never had it been laid bare like this. Never had the truth been spoken so clearly. The hesitation lasted only a second, but it was enough. JD Vance took another step forward, speaking not just to the judge, but to everyone in the room. "You can try to throw me out. You can try to shut me up, but it won't work, because after today, people will know the truth. And once the truth is out, there's nothing you or anyone else can do to stop it." Judge Harrington's face twisted with fury. His power, the shield he had wielded for years, was slipping through his fingers. He had never felt so exposed, so vulnerable. And for the first time in his career, he realized something terrifying. He wasn't the one in control anymore. Judge Harrington stood frozen, his fists clenched at his sides. The weight of the moment bore down on him, and for the first time, the gavel in his hand felt useless. The room no longer belonged to him. The power he had wielded for years, the authority that once silenced anyone who dared challenge him, was slipping away. JD Vance turned to the crowd. "This is how corruption dies," he said firmly. "Not in darkness, not in silence, but in the light, where everyone can see it." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Reporters scribbled furiously. Cameras clicked. The defense attorneys who once laughed at JD now sat stiffly, realizing that their ally on the bench was no longer untouchable. The bailiff finally stepped forward, not to remove JD, but to stand between him and the judge. His expression was unreadable, but the meaning was clear. Harrington no longer controlled the room. JD let the silence stretch before turning back to the judge. "This isn't over," he said. "Not by a long shot." Judge Harrington's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. He had nothing left to say. The truth was out, and no matter how hard he tried, there was no gavel loud enough to silence it.